by asking you to engage in a simple thought experiment. Try to imagine what the perspective of the world would be if you were an ant crawling on stage during a play, during a Shakespeare play, for example. All around you, there's this complex drama unfolding with dramatic sounds and rich colors, dramatic events. But because you don't understand the language, you don't understand the story being told, it all seems like just a chaotic jumble of disconnected events. If you understood the language, if you understood the story, you'd see that all the different events, the sounds, the images, the story, it all fits together. And I bring that up because I think it's a good way to describe our predicament on the world stage in terms of our place in world history. It's as though we are in this complex, vast drama with billions of actors, and all these things are happening, but it seems like a chaotic jumble of events, and that's because we don't understand the language. We don't understand the story being told. If we did, we'd understand that those events, that the geological upheavals, the political changes, the triumphs and the tragedies all come together in a sort of cohesive whole. And astrology gives us a way to understand that story, that language. It gives us several ways, actually. And the main one that I want to talk about here is the idea of the great ages. And that's, in very simplest terms, that's the idea that history can be broken down into roughly 2,000-year chapters. And that as these chapters unfold, maybe about 2,100, it's an approximation. We don't know exactly how long they are. It depends on various factors astronomically. But in a nutshell, it has to do with this idea that as the vernal point, you see the first day of spring at the sunrise, you have the sun against a certain point of the sky, against a certain constellation. And as time, every 72 years, you have that vernal point, the point of the first day of spring, the first moment of spring. That point moves backwards through the constellations because of the way the Earth is wobbling. And it moves through the constellations, and as it does, there's a shift in the world mythologies, a shift in the values and the symbols of culture. And, you know, a lot of books, if you study the great ages in terms of essays or books or lectures, they tend to focus on the astronomical dynamics a lot. I don't want to talk about that so much. I want to talk here mainly about the meaning of the great ages. What do these things mean in terms of the shifts between the different ages? But before I do, I have to clear up a couple of misconceptions, misunderstandings maybe. One is the idea that some people feel that it's not even a legitimate phenomenon. Of course, astronomers don't think that the great ages have an astrological significance. Everybody tends to agree that there is such a thing as precession of the equinox. Precession as opposed to procession. Pre means backwards. It has to do with that vernal point moving backwards through the constellations. So everybody agrees that that's a real phenomenon, but astrologers believe that that has a symbolic meaning. Astrologers believe that that has significance in terms of world affairs. And not even every astrologer believes that. Some believe that it's an overblown sort of concept. For example, the great theosophical astrologer Charles Carter, and he was a great astrologer, he wrote, "It's probable that there is no branch of astrology on which more nonsense has been poured forth than the doctrine of the precession of the equinoxes." The funny thing is, I agree with him, insofar as there has been a lot of nonsense written about it. But there's also been a lot of nonsense written about God. That doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It just means there's a lot of nonsense out there about it. The other thing that you sometimes find is this idea that it's an overly simplistic notion. My colleague, brilliant Nick Campion, was saying that the notion of the precession of the equinoxes, the great ages, it's a very, he didn't use the word simplistic, but he said you can't boil down the complexities of history into these 2,000-year brackets. I agree with that too. And that's why, in fact, his idea was that you have to look at planetary cycles. That's a very important factor, like when Jupiter, Saturn, and Saturn come together, or, for example, Pluto, Neptune, or various other planetary cycles. That's a more microscopic way of looking at the flow of history. And I agree with that, but that's why I couple the two together. I think you have to bring the great ages together with the planetary cycles, because the planetary cycle approach is also very simplistic. If I ask you, for example, what was life like back in 3100 BC? What are you going to do to figure out what that's like? Are you going to look at the patterns of Jupiter, Saturn at the time? Are you going to look at Uranus, Pluto, Neptune, things like that? That will give you certain insights into the period. But it's kind of like going into a Shakespeare play and hearing a few lines of dialogue, but not knowing the context, not knowing the stage setting, not knowing the scene itself, maybe just knowing the individual moments. That's what the planetary cycles tend to be like. The great ages give you the stage set. They give you the context in which those planetary cycles unfold. The bottom line is, if you look at history for the last few thousand years, at least for the last 6,000 years, you see some very striking correspondences between what happened in history and the great ages. And what I want to do here tonight is go over some of these examples of mainly the Piscean age and the Aquarian age, because we don't quite have enough time to go much more into the earlier stages. Plus, we only have a limited amount of information about prior to the age of, well, we have the age of Aries, but before that it gets very murky. So I want to begin with the age of Pisces here. And what does the age of Pisces mean? What significance did this have in culture? We have to look at a few things, and the first thing we have to decide is, when did it begin? So for instance, most astrologers, not all, most astrologers would say that the age of Pisces began around the birth of Christ, give or take a few hundred years on either side. Some disagree with that, like Rudolf Steiner, but in general, most believe that that started around the time of Christ. And you see an extraordinary confluence of symbols associated with Pisces in terms of Christianity. The reason I picked Christianity